The leader has turned lecture on, and your line will remain muted until the conference leader unmutes your line.
It is a major organization. Remember, we have a lot of full second version. Yeah, you've got it there.
That's where I usually.
That's where you are.
Not texting. Not looking. Hilarious. I thought he had that on the website. Hi, Dale Barber. They're from volunteer. Are you friends with Yeah. Okay. That's funny. I didn't know that. Yeah. So maybe after one Friday, we could connect and we go there. We do lots of games with your children and stuff.
Put our emergency mic up for even though I'd like to get you liability or you never stay closer. So turn this on just to get them down. Walking around. So if someone has questions, I need to make sure they get that mic. Oh, actually, young ladies probably. Right. So if I have questions during the wait for someone to get a mic, they'll probably have that thing. Okay. Sometimes they'll talk like, hey, can you get them a mic? Okay. I always try to control them. Yeah. Conference service. Thank you. So I'll put this in the back. I think generally it's an introduction.
Right. Okay.
It's always an anticipation.
Yep, I understand. It's good to have this.
Thank you. Yep. And everything went well with you?
Good.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, I'm not sure. Perfect, these mics are on, great. So good morning, everybody. I'm Lenore Jarvis. I'm one of the emergency medicine physicians, and I'd just like to point out Allison Jackson, too, so she's one of our CAPC physicians as well. We're really excited to have you here today, and just like to offer a special thanks to the Children's Health Board Grants and its president, Rosalia Miller, as well as the Child and Adolescent Protection Center for providing funding for our guest today, Dr. Andrew Campbell, who is an expert on domestic violence and will talk about the impact of domestic violence on children. We're also really excited to have some special guests in the audience today as well. We have some folks from the District of Columbia Public Schools, as well as the Office of State Superintendent Education. And then we also have some folks today from the DC Volunteer Lawyers Project, so welcome. As I introduce our guest, Dr. Andrew Campbell is a researcher and educator whose areas of expertise include emotional maltreatment, domestic violence, and the threats of harm to children living in homes where domestic violence is known to occur. Andrew provides education to law enforcement, attorneys, judges, medical professionals, social service providers, child protective service staff, school counselors, and education staff related to domestically violent homes and the physical and emotional threats of harm these threats of the environment posed to these children. Please help me on welcoming Dr. Andrew Campbell this morning.
Good morning. I just want to thank you so much for having me. I've been very much looking forward to this opportunity. This is a topic I'm very passionate about. For a long time, I've always had a real passion for wanting to help victimized populations, particularly children. My own personal experience growing up in a background where I really, I was exposed to a extended period of toxic stress, which we'll get into toxic stress a little later, and didn't necessarily feel like I had anyone there to help me. So I've always felt a real passion for trying to identify population sets that I can do something to help. I had looked at child fatalities, child abuse, other things like that, and then I had an incident one day that really stuck in my mind. I was out on a run, just an innocent run out in my neighborhood, came across a scene where a woman was laying on her back, two double black eyes, abrasions, you can tell fresh abrasions, with a man standing over her, a very traumatic and ongoing incident. I don't know if I responded in an appropriate way looking back on it with looking at risks and things like that, but I immediately approached, got into, or ran up on this scene. The gentleman was very much intoxicated under the influence of I don't know who knows how many substances, and then was making a beeline for his vehicle. So, and it was on a very busy intersection. So immediately now, I've got a very ongoing situation in front of me, and then now I'm watching a gentleman who I was pretty sure was going to do quite a bit of damage out on the road, on a very busy road. I got between him and his vehicle while another neighbor was calling the police and said, "You're not leaving, you're not going anywhere." He ran inside to his house, which immediately, in my mind, he's going to get a weapon, is what I thought. He's coming out and he's going to shoot us. That was my immediate thought. So I ran to the woman who was laying on her back and said, "This is very important. Do you have a weapon in your home?" And she said, "Yes." Later, I found out it was pepper spray that she was referring to. But obviously, in the time, that didn't do me a lot of good. So immediately, I'm still on this mindset. Fortunately, an officer showed up at that time. I ran to his car and said, "This is what's going on. We need to be treating this like something, that this individual is going to get a weapon and going to be bringing it back out." Fortunately, I guess in this incident, he actually locked himself in his closet, and the officers found him crying in his closet. So it didn't go the direction I thought it would, but in my mind, it really stood out as being, I guess it drew my attention to domestic violence. I mean, how could it not, obviously? So at that point, I began to just submerge myself in the literature, just everything I could get my hands on, reading every article, every book, everything I could get. I'm thinking, not only do I want to increase my knowledge on this topic, but I also want to look for things I'm not seeing. So what are the areas and things that I'm not reading in the literature? And so that's where my work kind of has evolved in trying to fill those gaps. As I said, I was exposed to toxic stress myself. We'll get into that more later, but for me, it was we'll typically we see either a hyper or an under-responsive stress or physiological response to stress when you're exposed to it for that long. For me, it was hyper-responsive. So public speaking has always been absolutely terrifying for me. I would say probably as recently as 2 to 3 years ago, just going through a checkout line at Walmart would terrify me. I can't even describe. I would begin to sweat profusely, I couldn't even handle it. But I reached a turning point where the idea of not speaking out for these victims scared me more than my fear of public speaking. So I just encourage you today to listen. Domestic violence is something you hear a lot about. Obviously, it's a very common topic that's thrown around commonly. It can be easily just shut down because you hear it so much. But I encourage you just to keep an open mindset to listen, and even if it's just one thing that you can take away, I encourage you to do so. Also, before we begin, I want to encourage you to stop me at any time. Please feel free at any point. If you have questions, I'm going to be throwing a lot of data at you. I'm sitting on a gold mine. I just published the largest study of its kind using law enforcement data to look at these types of incidents. So I analyzed nearly 10,000 cases. So I've got a lot of data. So I'm going to be bringing that to you today. So please, at any point you have any other questions that you'd like to discuss, please stop me. Again, as was said, I'll be talking about domestically violent homes and some of the threats of harm that these homes pose to children. I have nothing to disclose regarding financial disclosures, much as Charlie and Mia, I don't know how well you can see in the back, but pictured there, had nothing to disclose after I was given very strict instructions, do not let them out of your sight. It had rained very badly the day before, and I would say 15 seconds. It's a max of 15 seconds that I lost sight, and then my 11-year-old stepson, I heard him say, "You're dead." And I turned around to find the pup sitting there in that condition. So the objectives of our talk today, we're going to be describing how DV and child maltreatment intersect. We're going to look at some specific threats of harm to young children, infants, and really all children in these homes. And we're also going to look at some approaches to kind of protecting children and mitigating some of these injuries that they're likely to suffer while in these environments. So just quickly, just kind of some introductory slides, which will be reviewed for many of you, but then we'll get into more of the meat of the talk. The definition I use for domestic violence is the intentional use of physically or emotionally damaging behavior by one adult toward another, often to gain or maintain control in the home. It's very important to remember that emotional part. I am reminded of a child fatality investigation where the perpetrator began to share information not necessarily related to that specific incident, as they often will do, allowing them to speak. He talked about his relationship with the child's mother. He said, "I can hit her, I can punch her, she's a rock. She will fall to the ground, can't touch her. But the minute I tell her that she's unloved, that I've had better, or that she's ugly, I can do whatever I want with her." So it's just an important reminder to think about. Obviously, there's a lot of physical risk in these homes, but sometimes that emotional risk and emotional control actually can be more damaging. We think of the broken bones and bruises can heal, but those emotional scars often last a lifetime without any kind of intervention. We most commonly see domestic violence, at least, again, a lot of my work is working with law enforcement, so I see most of my data comes from cases that are reported to law enforcement. So in terms of what I see, about 87% of the cases are man against a woman, but we also see women against men. Same-sex couples represent about 3% of the population in my study. But then there's also other family dynamics, adult versus adult in the home. It's important to note that all of these, regardless of the gender breakdowns, are going to be likely to be harming to children that are living in this environment. Prevalence. We know it's widespread and affects professionals across all disciplines. You're likely to see it regardless of your discipline. So 30 to 40% of families involved in the child welfare system will have some sort of history of domestic violence. Depending on where you are in the country, as much as 50% of your law enforcement calls will be related to domestic violence, and up to 35% of all hospital ED visits are attributed in some form or in some way to domestic violence. And it's also important to note that adult victims may be more likely to seek care for their children. So again, here at Children's Hospital and Children's Health Center, you have a lot of opportunity to see some of those victims coming in. So looking at federal data, and again, as I said, when I was looking for kind of my area of focus and research, this was something that stuck out to me. There we go. So when you look at, this is the U.S. Department of Justice report, and domestic violence is right here, infant partner violence is right here, continuing to show a decline as we increase in years up to 2014. And typically when I ask this and I go around the country and ask if anyone else is experiencing the same thing, I get a lot of the confused looks I'm seeing right now and a lot of head shaking no. And so I began to become very interested in why federally reported numbers were showing a decrease. Obviously, these numbers are important because they can affect a lot of funding and things like that. And so that's kind of where my study started. I wanted to figure out, is there a way to look at data differently to better understand why we're seeing numbers that are decreasing when professionals around the country are telling me that they are not. One potential issue with some of these reports is that they are self-reported. And so even not just domestic violence, but any kind of self-reported studies, as we know, they can exclude certain people groups. So the very poor, those who do not speak English, those who live chaotic lives, military families, and then individuals as you see there, who are hospitalized, homeless, institutionalized, or incarcerated. Again, when we think about domestic violence, a lot of perpetrators, victims may fit very well into those groups who are likely to be excluded from surveys. Looking at specific surveys, this is the National Violence Against Women survey, only 10% of respondents were African American women. Only 19% were female adults under the age of 30 years. Another survey, the National Crime Victimization survey, 77% of respondents were non-Hispanic white female. And only 30% of respondents live in urban areas. And only 30% had one or more children in a household. So I started looking at those numbers and breakdowns and started to wonder, is this an accurate reflection of domestic violence as it's occurring across the country? And that's what generated my interest in my study. So the study that was just published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, I analyzed over 9,000 incidents that occurred in the time period you see there. My incidents involved over 9,000 suspects, 9,000 victims, and 7,500 witnesses. There's the study right there, which can be found, and I can share with you if you have interest in after the talk. So when I looked at my study population now with an N of, like I said, 9,355 incidents, it may be difficult to see for some of you in the back, but does anything jump out to you? So think about what I just talked about with the surveys and nationally reported numbers, and then look at my numbers in terms of using law enforcement. So these are incidents where law enforcement responded. Do you see any differences, or is there anything that jumps out in your head that maybe doesn't align with some of the nationally reported numbers? Any thoughts? Higher African American populations? Yep. So that's a very, very good point. So we see that 51% of victims, 56% of witnesses, and 59% of the suspects were African American, compared to my county population of only 26%. So a disproportionate representation. But as you remember, when we looked at the federal numbers, only 10% of respondents were African American women. Any other thoughts or ideas? Yes.
Much younger population than the other studies reported on.
Yep, so younger population. Again, so we talked about very few respondents under the age of 30, but when we look at law enforcement data, we see half of the victims are under the age of 30. Any other thoughts? Those were two of the important ones. Another one that stands out to me as being important is these witnesses. So when we're looking at the witnesses, we're looking at a huge proportion of witnesses that are under the age of 14. 37% under the age of 5, 19 in the 5 to 9 range, and then 12% in the 10 to 14. So again, we're looking at the majority of these witnesses being children, and many of them young children. Overall, looking at prevalence now, so again, looking at the national average reported numbers through self-reports when I use law enforcement data. And it's also important to note that most studies show that only about 1 in 4 cases ever get reported to law enforcement. So even though my numbers appear high, they're actually probably on the low end. So what I found was about double the national average when I'm using actually law enforcement data, with almost half of these being characteristic of severe intimate partner violence. So not just domestic violence, which is already damaging and concerning. Now we're adding either intentional burn, weapon use, strangulation, things that seem to kind of raise the ante a bit. Here's a sampling of where these incidents occurred. So essentially all over my city or Indianapolis, Marion County there. And when we kind of drill down deeper and look at these areas using geospatial mapping, now looking at median household income. So your lighter colors, your tans, or the tan, brown, orange, these lighter colors represent lower levels of income. So occurring in most of our areas of the city where we see low or below U.S. median household income. And then now looking at unemployment with your oranges and your browns being the higher numbers, so occurring in high areas of unemployment. Neither of those are surprising. That's been reported widely in literature. Any other thoughts on risk factors for DV that jump out in your head or that you're aware of, looking for anything from anyone? Mental illness? Any other thoughts? Substance abuse? So two important ones. A limited level of education is also tied to that. A lack of social support. Being victimized by violence as a child, which we'll get into a little bit more today. And then heavy alcohol, drug use, mental illness, as well as something that ties in well with that, or ties in like that. And again, that's what I saw in my study. So over half of the suspects had a history of drug, alcohol abuse, or mental illness. 54%, so again, over half, were under the influence on the scene. and nearly half are unemployed. So again, we're talking about risk factors that are affecting a huge proportion of this population. Oversimplified, essentially, we've got a perpetrator who has all of these things that they feel like they can't control, or at least they feel that they don't think they can control, reacting in a form of control. And domestic violence, child maltreatment are the two areas that we're talking about today. So on average, couples with IPV history have had how many prior unreported incidents? So to clarify, this is when law enforcement is called to a home for domestic violence. How many incidents that are either as bad or more violent do victims report having had occurred before law enforcement is even involved? Any thoughts or ideas? 5? 10? That's correct, it was 10. But it's important to note that most of these couples were very early in their relationship, within the first couple of months. So when we look at 10 incidents, we're talking about 5 per month. So we're looking at more than 1 per week of what would be considered, as again, I said almost half of those incidents were severe. So we're looking at a lot of violence occurring in these homes. And again, that just shows, as I said, most of these couples were pretty early in their relationship. The majority were in that first year that you see far on the left. This is essentially just the remainder, the 181 to 600, which is why it spikes. For the most part, we kind of see it decrease as it goes down. The incidents often escalated in intensity and risk over time. Just kind of an example of a continuum of what we saw in some of these cases. So here I'll just provide some examples. You can probably read it all in the back. But so suspect punches hole in the wall, suspect gives the victim black eye, suspect kicks the family dog down the stairs, suspect strangles the victim, suspect knocks the victim unconscious in the living room, and then you get the 911 call. So again, we hear all the time that families have a history of domestic violence. We hear it so often it can be easy just to dismiss it. We really need to understand that if they have a history of violence, we are talking, at least what my study's showing and looking at law enforcement data, of some very, very traumatic events that are continually occurring in the home. If the children or caregiver are not injured in the current event that you're looking at or dealing with, it's probably likely that they were affected in some manner by at least one or more of the events that occurred prior to that. Here's an excerpt of a incident. The suspect reportedly chased the victim, and again, be thinking about, we're going to start shifting, so be thinking more about children in the home and how this is likely to play out for them. The suspect reportedly chased the victim throughout the home before the victim managed to lock herself in the upstairs bathroom. The suspect broke through the bathroom door with a baseball bat and dragged the victim down the hall to her bedroom. The victim struggled with the suspect, at which point he struck the victim over the head with a lamp, knocking her unconscious. The victim's 3 children were present in the home, but had been locked in their bedrooms prior to the incident and did not witness the event. A show of hands, how many people feel pretty good about the children in that home? I mean, the fact that they've been locked in their bedroom and did not witness the event, it's very hard to believe that a child is not going to experience that traumatic of an incident. Even if they're not visually seeing it, they're obviously likely to hear a great deal of that going on and see the after effects and the prior incidents that have likely occurred. So when we talk about how violent these events are getting, ideas on the % of these incidents that include current or past allegations of strangulation. Thoughts or ideas on how many of these cases, either the current one or the victims will report a history of strangulation occurring when law enforcement is involved. Any ideas? How much, sir? 30, half, 90, 80? So 51, a little over half, had current or past. The current incident was right around 30%, 51 when you include past. And what about weapon use? Now, I do need to clarify the way law enforcement and DV data is usually reported. It's usually using a weapon or an object as a weapon. Any ideas on how frequently that occurs? 70. It's actually 34. So we're seeing 34% of weapon use, 51. Again, just getting to the nature of the violence in these incidents. I'm just looking a little more at strangulation. So in existing literature, most of what I could find showed about 10% of IPV victims were strangled during an incident. As I said in my study, it was 29% looking at law enforcement data. Looking a little further at that, 60% of these strangulation victims had visual symptoms that the officers could document, but only 14 received any sort of medical treatment, which again is alarming. My understanding from speaking with law enforcement on this is that they are very adamant in recommending that these victims go receive medical treatment, but the victims will often refuse it and not comply and refused to get any kind of care for that. 84% of these victims said it wasn't the first time they'd been strangled. 31% of the pregnant IPV victims also reported strangulation, with only 17% of them receiving any sort of medical treatment. That's on the scene, transport, anything. So again, very alarming, particularly in the medical field, knowing all of the risks that can occur immediately relating to strangulation as well as delayed risk. Obviously quite concerning. And then further, when we look at incidents involving strangulation versus those that do not, and again, for time's sake, I won't go through each line as part of the study that I said I can make available, but we see a statistically significant increase in essentially every variable I can measure. So recent death threats, suspect threatening to kill the victim or their child, suspect using a weapon, abuse against animals in the home goes from 1% to 5%. Forced sex goes from 3% to 14%. So essentially when we know IPV is occurring, we're concerned. When we know strangulation is a component of that, our fear and concern should be heightened. Any ideas on the days of the week that IPV is most likely to occur? Saturday, you say? Weekends, okay. Weekends? Friday, football season, weekends? And again, this is something that's unique to our study because I can actually use police reports as opposed to self-reports, which victims may not know the specific day. Sunday was actually the day we saw the most incidents. It's important to note that an incident occurring Saturday night in the early morning hours would be marked as a Sunday. So it is important to note that. But looking at Saturday and Sunday, and then months, any ideas on months of the year that we're going to see this occur? July. Winter, so I'm hearing summer or winter. It was actually right there in the middle. So May, June, July, August is where we see our spike. So thinking about those two things, Saturdays and Sundays, May, June, July, August, anything jump out as being particularly concerning about those days of the week and that time of the year? Kids are home from school, school's out. So children live in blank % of homes where DV occurs. Any ideas? 70? 65? So in my study, I found that 60%, overall ended up being 59%. But when you break it down by the suspect victim, you see 60% of the homes when it's a male suspect, female victim, down to 56, and all the way, it's still a third of the homes in a male versus male situation involve children. So we're seeing children frequently involved either in the incident or at least being members of the household where these violent acts are occurring. Looking at other national reported numbers, so 15.5 million children, it's estimated, are exposed annually in the U.S. Again, likely to be a very low estimate. It's likely to be many more than that. With younger children disproportionately represented, again, looking at children under the age of 5. A different law enforcement study from 1997 found that 81% of these children that were in these homes experienced direct sensory exposure, but only 4% showed physical signs of injury. I've talked with several officers who and other responders who state that they look specifically for bruising, for some sort of visual indicator to determine whether or not child services should be involved, whether the child has been victimized. So again, it's important to note that if we're just looking for those physical indicators, we're missing a huge portion of children who are likely to be very much affected. Children living in a home where DV occurs are at blank times the risk of maltreatment compared to the general population. Any ideas? I'm sorry for asking you so many questions. It's early in the morning, but any ideas on the times risk? 20? So I'll get to the answer. So U.S. Department of Health reported in 2013 the number there of children that was abused or neglected in the U.S., which represents about 1% of the entire U.S. child population. In homes where DV occurs, prevalence has been reported around 60%. So we're looking at 60 times the risk. Again, substantial and really a terrifying risk for children in these homes. Threats of harm to them in these homes are across all types of abuse and neglect. Physical abuse, obviously, very real concern. I'm reminded of a young man around the age of 12 named Jared, whose mother had just broke up with her boyfriend. She worked a night shift as a nurse, left her son alone that evening. The ex-boyfriend showed up at the house, which is Jared there, knocked on the door, and he let him in, and he said, his words were, "I'm sorry, but this is the only way I can get through to your mom." And he proceeded to physically assault the child for 40 to 45 minutes, ending with Jared tied to a chair in a strangulation episode. So we know that there are very real and scary physical threats. Also, we see an increase in the risk for sexual abuse, for neglect, and then emotional maltreatment as well. We're going to hit a little more on the emotional side today. As I said, the increased risk for physical abuse, sexual abuse, it kind of depends on what study you look at. So the study there at the top out of Texas saw that about 67%. The middle of the study there from Atlanta and San Diego areas saw around 36%. And then down there in the Durham area, we're looking at more than 70%. So again, it's kind of a range, but they all agree that it's definitely an increased risk of sexual abuse as well. As I said, emotional maltreatment, so we're going to focus a little more today. So emotional maltreatment can be a single, significantly impactful incident, or it can be an underlying theme of a series of events. And so again, when you think about what I described in these home environments, we're looking at both occurring. There's likely to be very impactful incidents, but also just a whole series of events as well. For the sake of time, we're not going to get a whole lot into that. I did want to point you to a paper that I wrote for the Pediatric Clinics of North America just on this topic. So if it's something that you're interested in, you can see I go a lot more into emotional maltreatment in that particular publication. It's commonly missed because it often underlies more visually symptomatic forms of abuse. Again, looking at another study where they found 75 to 90% of cases of physical abuse or neglect had emotional maltreatment. And it's often when we look at studies that look at, for instance, like Child Protective Services reports, it's usually the physical symptoms and the physical abuse that gets documented and not so much the emotional or invisible injuries. And again, another paper, again, sorry, with tight on time, this is for child abuse and neglect that I published a couple years ago on this very topic, looking at responders and how they respond to these incidents and different gaps in terms of identifying, looking at age, nature of exposure and things like that. It can just be very difficult to document, obviously, emotional injuries, and that is a real problem and difficulty. How does emotional maltreatment affect children? It affects them very much, obviously, is the short answer. So looking at brain development from the earliest stages of infancy, again, thinking of conversations with responders, I usually find them shocked to find out that before a child can speak, before a child can voice concerns, that they are likely to be experiencing damage from these types of incidents. When we talk about these home environments, we're often looking at a lack of that healthy stimulus that is so crucial and vital to these young children to assist in brain development and encourage it. Again, we're looking at toxic stress. So when you think about the environment that I've kind of described to you today, think about the level of stress that these children are likely to be under. It's likely to be constant, never changing or never going down, at least. And obviously, as we know, constant exposure is related to a constant or excess release of cortisol in your blood flow, which can lead to all sorts of problems for the brain and an alteration of your body's stress response. As I said early on, for me, it was hyper-responsive. So I was exposed to a lot of stress, and then when I would experience stress, I would become hyper-responsive. We either see that typically or a shutdown, one way or the other. But the takeaway is that these children are learning an inappropriate and experiencing inappropriate response to stress in their own home, and then as they grow up and become adults, without intervention, they're going to be experiencing the same type of issues. It's also important to note that the state of development interrupted could also determine how a child is affected by this toxic stress exposure. So we're looking at the younger the age of the child, potentially the more damaging outcomes we're going to see with those essential and critical developmental milestones occurring in those early months and years even before birth. Here's a image of a normal 3-year-old brain there on the left with a child who is exposed to what was considered an extremely neglectful environment on the right there. And as you can see, again, without that healthy stimulus, we're looking at smaller brain issues with memory, learning, and behavior likely to be occurring. And again, the children are less likely to be able to learn how to appropriately regulate stress. We know that it affects the child's mental and physical development as well. So we can state they're showing a dose response, even under the age of 5, with a lower IQ when they're involved in an emotionally maltreated, or when they're being emotionally maltreated, deficits in memory, diminished learning capacity, and a smaller brain volume. So again, we're talking about children in these environments that are exposed to all of these types of violent occurrences and incidents, and we're just putting them even further back when they're matching it with their peers as they enter the school system, being behind in all these areas, or likely to be behind. It can also kind of help or can blur the lines between what's acceptable and normal behavior. If a child is continually seeing conflict resolution in this manner, obviously it's going to make it very difficult for them to understand what is the appropriate way to resolve conflict and what is not. It can also teach them that inappropriate response to stress. And this victimization, as we said before, actually can make them more likely to either be a perpetrator or a victim of the same type of violence as they get older and become adults. And then also we see children as early as 4 months showing symptoms of withdrawal and depression from residing in these home environments. An example of this is, again, looking at observations. So these are first responders observing victims and children in the home. And so here is the description or descriptors of the adult victims according to officers as they arrive on scene. So we're seeing adult victims most likely to be considered or to be complaining of pain, to be afraid, and to be crying. This is the observations of the responding officer. When we look at observations of children on the scene, we see them, half of them, considered to be calm on scene. Is that reassuring for anyone in the room to find? Yeah, alarming. And the other component, though, is without that education, without that understanding, we do see a lot of people seeing them as calm as being a relief, as, well, they were unaffected. Well, they're calm, so they were able to handle it. They're okay. They're going to be fine. And that is quite alarming to think about these children seeing their caregivers in this state, being afraid, complaining, crying. And again, this is the victimized caregiver, not even the perpetrator. This is someone who would hope that a child is strongly attached to, and yet still being able to appear calm just moments after these violent events. So that's going to help kind of shift. So we've talked a little bit about the violent offending caregiver and some of the risks that they pose. But we also want to talk about the non-violent victimized caregiver and some of the individualized risks that this caregiver can provide as well. And I do want to clarify, because I have had it said before, that, well, the victimized caregiver has already been victimized, and now you're just trying to figure out a way to take their children from them. That is not all my point. I just think it's important that we note that the victimized caregiver often poses a threat to children as well. It may be different, where education and support can kind of help mitigate some of that, but it's still important to note that both caregivers actually present a risk to these children. So here again, here's another excerpt from an actual incident. The violent offending caregiver has been imprisoned and therefore no longer has access to the children in the home. The mother has no intention of letting him return to the home. The threat to the children has been removed. Again, who feels safe about that? Yeah. Again, very concerning for a number of reasons. A study is dated, but a study that I do like, from Egeland 1987, looked at 267 high-risk families. They identified these families as high risk, looking at poverty, limited education. 40% of the mothers were teenagers, and what they characterized as chaotic living conditions. And they compared these groups to a control group that they determined was providing adequate care. So they looked at 4 specific maltreatment groups, looked at physically abusive parenting styles, hostile, verbally abusive, psychologically unavailable, and neglecting. So looking for a response from one of you, which group displayed the most negative and damaging consequences from a particular parenting style? Any ideas on which group would have, obviously all are likely to be damaging and negative, but which seem to be the worst when we look at that? Any thoughts? Neglect, psychologically unavailable and neglect. So psychologically unavailable parenting seems to children who experience that suffer the most dramatic consequences, particularly if it occurred during the first 2 years of their life. So again, psychologically unavailable early on in childhood. And here's kind of a continuum of what that looked like. I can read some of it in case you can't see in the back. So at 9 to 24 months, we're already looking at a child being anxiously attached with a decline in intellectual functioning. By 24 to 42 months, we're looking at little positive affect, scoring lower on developmental exams. By preschool, highly dependent on teachers, nervous and self-abusive behavior. By elementary, low in peer acceptance, and overall emotional health, more aggressive, and again, performing worse on achievement tests. And finally, by their teen years, they're more aggressive, more suicidal, and the majority have at least 2 psychiatric disorders. So again, we're talking about once the ball starts rolling in this direction without some sort of intervention, It's just likely to continue to put these children at a disadvantage as they get older and older. Kind of the continuum of what we're talking about when we look at the victimized caregiver is we've got a caregiver whose emotional needs are unmet. They're unable then to meet the needs of the child just because they simply don't have it. I mean, there's not enough energy there. We see a breakdown of that critical relationship, resulting in behavioral difficulties in the child, and that just further exacerbates this already difficult relationship. Okay, so we kind of talked a lot about, quickly, about a lot of different risks. Now we're going to talk briefly on how we can identify some of these victims. So, again, there's a great amount of difficulties in doing so. So a victimized caregiver will commonly withhold information for a variety of reasons. Any thoughts? I gave you one there. Any thoughts on why these victimized caregivers will not speak out to anyone? Shame? Any other thoughts? Retribution? Good point. They don't want their kids taken away. Financial support. All of those good and valid. They're concerned for their safety, so further endangering themselves and their children, and we see that to be true. Studies continually show that women and children in these environments are at very much increased risk when they're trying to flee one of these homes. They often depend on the income of the offender, especially with a long-term relationship. It can be much more difficult to break free from that. If the offender is a biological parent, it just presents even more difficulty. And then the other things that were shared as well were very good points. And then sometimes they may feel like they have nowhere to go. I know locally, my home state, here recently, there was news, it's been a couple years ago, but a news story published talking about one of our local domestic violence shelter that turned away nearly 2,000 victims just because there was no funding and no place to put them. And many of those were victims who felt like a great risk. But again, so they may just have this idea that there's nowhere else to go, but they're also, if these victims have had all of their social support taken away, they really may have nowhere else to go. So that's difficulties in terms of getting a truthful response from victims. From children, we may also see them not respond truthfully. This excludes kind of the 3-year-old range. Usually you can get the honest story from a 3-year-old, but some of the older kids may provide a coach or scripted response. But then they also may fear further injury to loved ones or pets. When you think again about these environments I've described, these children have a violent offending caregiver and then a victimized caregiver who is also unable to provide appropriate emotional support and care. So they may be very dependent on pets in the home. That may be their sole source of any kind of positive effect or positive influence. And perpetrators will very often try to exploit that very area. So here's a recent study that appeared in the Journal of Child Abuse and Neglect, with just some quick excerpts from that. So my dad last week said that he was very upset with my mother and that he was going to burn the bird's wings with a lighter. That day that my dad said he would burn my dog on the grill, I took him into my room and locked him in the closet with food and water until the next day. My dog always sleeps with me in my room so that my dad doesn't hurt him. Again, real concerns from children that particular relationship will also be exploited. And I found that to be the case in my study as well. Again, a lot going on there, but again, much as with strangulation, every measurable variable shows a statistically significant increase when we have animal abuse co-occurring with domestic violence. So now we've got 78% of victims think the suspect will kill them in a home when we know animal abuse is co-occurring with domestic violence. And you can see kind of just the substantial increase. Over a third increase in the history of forced sex with victims. 70% of these suspects are spying on the victim. 84% are jealous and control almost all of the victims' daily activities. Again, knowing that animal abuse is occurring, again, should raise your concern and also speaks to the importance of collaboration from other disciplines. So working with animal control, involving agencies that may be able to identify when animal abuse is occurring could also help with some of these other issues that we're talking about. So what can we do? Sounds simple, but asking the question. Continually, we see in national studies that the question is still not being asked. So here's a study from 2001 that looked at well child visits in 766 families, and 17%, 31%, 40%, there's 3 different cities. were the rates of DV that were occurring in these homes, but only a third, so they were ever asked about DV before by a medical professional. So again, missing a huge chunk of people that were not even asking. Another study that was a little different in terms of it asked physicians to predict whether DV or physical abuse was occurring in the home. This was 19 practices that looked at just under 2,000 parents. And so pediatricians detected or estimated DV to be occurring in 0.3% of cases when parents reported it in 4.2. Again, likely to be low for the reasons that parents are unlikely to report, but still quite elevated from predictions. And then detecting child abuse, 0.5% of parents reported it in 21.6% of cases. Just again, the idea of it's not good enough just to try to make an assumption. We need to be asking questions if we're going to identify them at all. It's important to know that we need to ask appropriate questions, though. When my 4-month-old, while we were going to regular doctor's appointments before he was born, a well-meaning nurse and well-intentioned nurse who asked the question, which was good, but again, it's looking at how you ask. So she walked into the room, pointed at me and said, "He doesn't hit you, does he?" Which I'm not saying to make light of it because it was asking, but it's important to note that if my wife was in an abusive relationship, it would probably be very hard for her to answer that affirmatively. And if she did answer that affirmatively, then you better be ready to protect her because now she's at great risk. If she's going to, in front of me, disclose that she is in an abusive relationship, you definitely would feel very uncomfortable, I would hope, sending that person home in that same relationship because now you've elevated the risk. Victims often won't respond well to asking straight up like a question like that. It's more, you're more likely to get an affirmative response or a truthful answer when you're focusing on behaviors and feelings. A lot of those trigger words like domestic violence, intimate partner violence will cause an immediate shutdown. If you can get into more, do you feel safe in this environment? Do you feel safe at home? Getting more into emotions and feelings seems to be a little more effective. And then again, asking away from a potential perpetrator because you're elevating the risk and making it harder for them to say yes. If they do say yes, you now put them at even more increased risk. And then looking at potential indicators or red flags. So again, the images there are often concerning for things like abuse or maltreatment, the subconjunctival hemorrhage, the bruising there on the ear, and the splat mark. After disclosure, as I said, it's important to have a plan. This is where it's critical before it happens that you're working with community partners to figure out for your particular region and your institution, what are you going to do when you do get that affirmative response? Now you're asking the question, but we need, I think national numbers were still at less than 50% of hospitals, though, had a plan of what to do if they did get an affirmative response. So we need to ask the question, but you also need to be very aware of your community partners and who you can refer and send these families to when that does occur. When those partners get involved, it's important that we're catching this early. As we've talked about the damage that can be done to these young children, we're also seeing a natural advantage to catching it early to where some of that stuff can be reversible and we can turn it around and work to give them, try to mitigate some of those damaging consequences. Obviously, these children and their caregivers are going to need mental health services and social support, a sense of routine, something many of these children do not experience when we think about the chaotic living conditions they live in. They're going to be needed to taught proper methods for conflict resolution because they have not seen that or visualized that, many of them, for their entire life. And then also what are appropriate dating relationship behaviors. Again, they've had the incorrect model put before them from a young age. It's also important to remember that it's very difficult to separate the well-being of a child and the well-being of a caregiver. If we're taking care of the children and we're working to kind of mitigate some of these negative influences, but if we send them right back in that same unchanged home environment, we're likely to just have to essentially do the same things all over again. So working to figure out a way to reduce caregiver stressors, to improve the environment, can maybe potentially help kind of make some of the other changes that we're doing with these children last longer. Quickly, because we're out of time, just two effective interventions that I think were pretty interesting that I wanted to share with you. One was the law enforcement response. Locally, I'll just add this. So there seems to be a discrepancy in published studies looking at arrests and protective orders and the effectiveness. Some studies show very effective, others do not. In my study, the strangulation incidents, animal maltreatment incidents, actually showed lower numbers of arrests, with perpetrators being more likely to be ranked as calm, much like we saw with children. So again, we get into a lot of, it can be very difficult on scene to make some sort of determination like that. The other difficulty is that a lot of these suspects flee the scene. So again, I said less than 10% of suspects were still in the home when law enforcement arrived. They had to be tracked down elsewhere. And 59% of those suspects were fleeing under the influence. So now again, you've got suspects fleeing the scene under the influence of alcohol or drugs or some other substance, now posing a threat to the community as well. The effective intervention that I mentioned is a Baker One project out of North Carolina. So this law enforcement group spent a great deal of time and energy focused on trying to reduce domestic violence in their community. They set up a hotline that was available 24/7 for the victims to call, a zero-tolerance policy with suspects, constantly checking in on these families, and they actually reported a 98.9% decrease in repeat calls in 7 target locations, and that was in spite of the fact that these incidents, occurrence of incidents continued to rise around them. They were able to show really a great positive result from that intervention. One other intervention I wanted to quickly share with you just, again, shows the importance of a multidisciplinary approach. The Mia Escuelita in the San Diego area in California is a school specifically set up for victims of domestic violence, preschool-age children. And so they are fully staffed with professionals who have trauma-informed treatment-type training, and they spend a great deal of time and energy working with these children, providing mental health services and things of that nature. An independent study by the University of San Diego found that children who went to this school and then went into the public health or public school system performed as good or better than their peers. And again, when we look at all the things we talked about in terms of how at a disadvantage these children are, it is encouraging to see that they can still get there with the right type of resources and energy and support. Survivors of emotional maltreatment report that having just one person unconditionally, give them unconditional positive regard, someone who thought well of them and made them feel important, was the single greatest contributor. Again, we see this pop up a lot in literature. Children are reporting just having that one person that can help them makes a huge difference. So with that, go ahead and stop there today. We're tight on time. Usually the last thing I see when I leave for work and the first thing I see when I come home. A little cleaner there in that picture. But any questions or thoughts? Thank you. I know it was a lot of data and a lot of information. I was trying not to overwhelm with it, but if you have any questions or thoughts, I can get it at this time. Yeah. Do we have a microphone?
Thanks, Dr. Campbell. Really an amazing presentation. You know, I'm interested in our role here at Children's National. We have an enormous number of clinical interactions in which we have the opportunity to access families and do case identification. So my question is around the issue of screening. Okay. What are some of the emerging best practices? You highlighted what might be a worse practice earlier, but you know, is it sufficient, for example, to simply hand out hotlines, put them in the bathrooms as we do in many of our clinical scenarios? Should we be giving all of our moms and teenagers tablets to report, giving them internet access to report, having a special private screening room? What are the best practices that when you think about our clinical scenarios here at Children's National?
Great question. So again, I think critical, regardless of how you're doing it, whether it's a tablet or paper form, or if you're using the flyers and documentation like you're saying, it's finding a way to do it away from the potential perpetrator. So, and which can be very tricky. Just being honest, there's no easy answer. There's no 100% proven effective way of doing this. We're still trying to figure it out. The tablets, I think, can be very effective in that they do allow for a little more privacy and ease of answer. It also takes away some of that discomfort of speaking to another person, and so now you're more privately being able to say, yes, this is what I'm experiencing, as opposed to having to verbally say it out loud to another individual who may or may not be intimidating to you just because of the fact of their education level and things of that nature. So I would think absolutely allowing a victim the privacy to do it away from the perpetrator And then also, I mean, it's hard to answer, to be honest with you, because some victims will respond better to that conversational type of approach, and so they will respond better to an individual who's asking, do you feel safe? Why do you not feel safe? Then they will begin to talk and they will open up. But others shut down. They do not want human interaction. So essentially the only best practice is really going to be doing both, a collaboration of both, finding a way to do it away from a potential perpetrator, which again is difficult to identify, but then just kind of blanking the statement. So I would say all of the above, doing it in every way possible. And when we talk about the risks of these children, I mean, we have to catch it as early as possible because these are the same people that are going to be continuing to pop up in the medical system over and over and over again as we look at effects of toxic stress down the road, physical, mental, all types of injury. So sorry if that's kind of, it's not as specific, but the reality and the nature of these incidents and what law enforcement says is like walking on eggshells. It's a very difficult situation because no two are the same. But I would say, yeah, you're going to want to do it in as many ways as possible and looking at having some flexibility based on the individual, whether they seem to respond better just on their own on a tablet or to questions. Any other thoughts? Yes?
Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Have there been any studies comparing the outcomes of on children of domestic violence versus the children being exposed to external violence, that is being in a war setting?
So in terms of the studies that I'm aware of, we see a lot of similarities in terms of the PTSD type symptoms, so toxic stress exposure. In terms of actually separating it out and saying war exposure versus home exposure, I don't know that there's really been a like a set percentages like I was just did with law enforcement data. Other than that, we see similarities. So they do experience many of those same PTSD characteristics from being in a war zone. They also, the studies that I've read have also compared soldiers returning home from war to the same type of mentality for young, particularly young children in these home environments. So the short answer is that very similar. In terms of seeing a study separated out, I haven't seen them necessarily say they're at a greater risk of this or that. So most studies I see say they're both at the same very high level risk of concern. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Thank you so much. In your data that you showed us focused on law enforcement data, have you seen any examples of interventions that included law enforcement data sharing with law enforcement in hospitals, children's hospitals?
It's very difficult. It took me 5 years to build relations to be able to get that data. And particularly for my region of the country, we do not see much data sharing. It's a major work in progress. There's a lot of difficulty in one organization trusting another with data. I'm not aware of a good model of the medical community and law enforcement working well with data. Definitely where my goal is. I have big goals with this area. I want to see a national standardized approach to responding to these incidents, and I want it to involve a lot of data and a lot of data sharing. That's where I want to get. But in terms of a model that's there now, there's nothing I'm aware of that shows a good example of the two working together like that, like you would hope. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Hi, I work for DCPS in a program called Teen Heights, and we work with teen parents. And so I'm seeing a trend where the girls, the moms are the perpetrators of domestic violence as opposed to the young fathers. However, they don't see it as domestic violence, and neither do the fathers, because we've all been taught it's the dads that are the abusive ones. I wanted to know on your level, are you all seeing this trend of the girls being the perpetrators of domestic violence?
So
the aggressor.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So in terms of, again, my data is dealing with law enforcement response. So in terms of incidents where the female is a perpetrator against a male and they involve law enforcement, so the male contacts law enforcement, it was about 10% of my cases that experienced that. So we're looking at 87% the other way, females versus male, 10% male versus female. So, that's an issue that I'm actually looking at another paper I'm writing, looking at some of those specific things, because it became unclear whether, why that is, if males are just less likely to involve law enforcement or if it's less likely to occur. I'm kind of leaning towards the idea that they're less likely to involve law enforcement, and that's occurring at a much higher rate than we understand or have any knowledge of. I anecdotally know of several instances just of it occurring, and so it's something I think that is very important. That's a very good point, that I believe that all types are underreported, but I think that type may be way more underreported than we even really have a good grasp of. I thought I saw one, yes.
So to add on to the practice of screening here at Children's, what do you think, to what extent should we screen with the child separately from the caregiver? And do you think it would be of added value to also separate the child from mom or dad while asking these questions?
So that's something you have to be very careful with, obviously, particularly if you've got a child that already has some kind of, that are living in these types of environments, because they may completely shut down in the absence of the caregiver, hoping that they are still strongly attached to them. And then you also want to be careful, I would think legally, I would think the legal aspect is something that you would definitely want to bring into play too, just for your institution. Looking at the age of children, again, 3, 4, 5, you're probably going to get an honest answer. If you ask the child, you're going to find out who's living in that home and what's happening in that home. But again, I would say that that's something that is an institution that you would have to decide for your own institution, that you would need to bring that legal component in there. Obviously, in the absence, when possible, from caregivers, children probably would be more likely to give you the honest answer. And so the easy answer would be to say yes, but I would say that I would involve the legal. Obviously, you want to make sure those pieces are covered. And then also that a child is in a situation where they don't feel discomfort, that they're not uncomfortable with whatever's going on, and that they will disclose that type of thing. Obviously, involving Department of Child Services and organizations like that is critical in that type of setting, and allow them to do their job in terms of asking those questions. So, any thoughts or questions? One more.
You mentioned, hi, my name is Monica. I'm a community health coordinator here at Children's. You mentioned you were interested in a national standardized approach as an overall goal that you have, and I was curious as to some of the steps that you're taking to kind of move towards that goal.
So I'm looking for, so the question was the idea of my national standardized and what are my steps to doing it. So just the idea of, like I said, when I was going through literature, finding this major gap in data, and then just seeing this one major study and what it's shown, I want to replicate it. I'm looking at other agencies across my state, but I also want to work with other agencies in other states. I think it's important to get our hands on as much data as we possibly can to better inform practice, because a lot of these, the reason why I don't have a whole lot of intervention ideas to be able to share today is because a lot of them are not data-driven, and they do not have good data to support whether they are effective or not. You can look at different news stories and see approaches and interventions, but when you actually reach out to them, many of them do not have data to show whether it is effective or not. They may have a couple cases, but on a widespread scale, we don't know. So I think the first step in where I've been living for the last 5 years is just getting my hands on as much data as possible. And then once we have that, I'm developing, even if it's as simple as when we know strangulation's in the home, we know everyone in the home is at risk, including the officer. So it's not just about protecting families, we're trying to protect the responders as well. So that's where I'm at now, is trying to find other organizations to work with to start kind of bringing that together. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes?
Are you aware of the recent study in Iowa that showed that getting civil protection orders substantially decreased re-victimization and increased psychological well-being and economic self-sufficiency for victims?
You're talking about the protection orders that we said?
Yes.
Yes, and so there are several that show that, but then there are a few that for whatever reason don't, and that's my only hesitation. But I mean, from the standpoint of when I think about the children in the home, another concern I would have is even if protection order keeps that particular perpetrator from coming back to the home, I would then be concerned what we often see the case of these caregivers bringing a different perpetrator into the home. And so it's still, but that is a good point, and that is one that there have been several studies to show them to be effective, but there also have been some to show that they're not to be effective for some of those reasons. So, but yeah, it's definitely encouraging to see things like that, but obviously would still be concerned for the children in the home. Good. Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Thank you.